Robert Oppenheimer was 59 years old. He weighed perhaps 120 pounds. His suit hung from his shoulders as if it had been tailored for someone else, someone who had once filled it, perhaps, but had since retreated inward, leaving only the architecture of a body behind. His face was grey. His posture was rigid. One observer described him as a figure of stone, tragic in his intensity. Beside him, Lyndon Johnson towered. Johnson had inherited the presidency after John Kennedy's assassination in Dallas just 10 days earlier, and the country was still in shock. The ceremony had been scheduled weeks before. Kennedy himself had approved the award. Now Johnson was carrying it out because cancelling it would have meant something worse than proceeding. The award was the Enrico Fermi Award, a gold medal, a citation, and a cheque for $50,000 given by the Atomic Energy Commission to recognise lifetime achievement in nuclear science. It was the highest honour the government could bestow on a scientist, and it was being given to a man whom that same government 9 years earlier had declared a security risk and stripped of his clearance in a proceeding so humiliating that one of the presiding commissioners had called it a black mark on the nation. Oppenheimer accepted the medal. He accepted the cheque. His wife, Catherine Kitty, as everyone called her, stood nearby, and she was, by every account, radiating joy. One old friend called her expression a study in pure exaltation. Robert's face showed nothing of the kind. He looked hollowed out. He looked like a man receiving something that had arrived too late to matter. In his brief acceptance speech, he mentioned Thomas Jefferson and the brotherly spirit of science. Then he turned to Johnson and said something that silenced the room. He said he thought it was just possible that it had taken some charity and some courage for the president to make this award today, and that this seemed to him a good augury for all their futures. It was a graceful line. It was also a knife, because everyone in that room understood what he meant. It had taken courage because powerful men in Washington still believed Oppenheimer was a traitor, or at best a fool, or at the very least a man whose judgment could not be trusted with the nation's secrets. And it had taken charity because the government that was now honouring him was the same government that had in 1954 put him through a quasi-judicial deal designed not to determine the truth, but to ensure a predetermined outcome. Edward Teller was in the audience that day. Teller, the physicist who had dreamed of the hydrogen bomb for a decade, and whose testimony during the security hearing had been the most damaging of all. Now Teller approached to offer his congratulations. Oppenheimer grinned and shook his hand. Kitty stood stone-faced beside her husband. A photographer caught the moment. The handshake looked like diplomacy. Kitty's expression looked like war. After the ceremony, word arrived from Jacqueline Kennedy. The former First Lady sent a message saying that she knew her late husband had intended the award as a signal, a gesture of rehabilitation. A quiet apology from the state to the man the state had wronged. Whether it was an apology or merely politics is a question that has never been settled. What is settled is this: by the time the medal reached Oppenheimer's hands, the damage had been done long ago, and not only to him. This is a story about Robert Oppenheimer. It is a story about a mind of extraordinary power, a man who could read Sanskrit for pleasure, who could hold the entire architecture of a weapons laboratory in his head, who could seduce a room full of Nobel laureates into following him to a mesa in the New Mexico desert and working 16-hour days to build something most of them believed should never exist. It is a story about what happens when a country asks a man to do an impossible thing and then punishes him for having done it. But it is also a story about something else, something that lives in the margins of the celebrated account and that, for 8 decades, has been visible only if you knew where to look. Because the atomic bomb was not built by one man. It was not built by 100 brilliant physicists either. It was built by thousands of people, scientists and soldiers, yes, but also construction workers, janitors, cooks, maids, truck drivers, technicians, secretaries, nurses and labourers, many of whom were recruited from the Hispanic communities and Native American pueblos that surrounded the mesa. Some of those communities had been living on that land for generations before the army arrived. Some of them were removed from their homesteads to make way for the laboratory. Some of them were paid almost nothing for the land that was taken. And when the story of Los Alamos was written, in newspaper accounts, in official histories, in the celebrated biographies, almost none of those people appeared. The women who ran the computing machines, who tested plutonium samples, who worked in the explosives assembly group, more than 600 of them at Los Alamos alone, were largely absent from the formal record. The families living 12 miles from the Trinity test site, who watched the sky turn white at 5:29 in the morning and then spent decades dying of cancers that no one would connect to that morning for another half-century. They were not part of the story at all. This documentary is going to tell the Oppenheimer story. The full one. His childhood on Riverside Drive, his breakdown at Cambridge, his political awakening at Berkeley, the building of Los Alamos, the Trinity test, Hiroshima, the security hearing, the long, quiet unravelling of his final years. All of it. Julius Oppenheimer arrived in New York in the spring of 1888. He was 17 years old, spoke not a word of English, and carried nothing of monetary value. His father, Benjamin Pinhas Oppenheimer, was an untutored peasant and grain trader who had been raised in what his grandson would later describe as an almost medieval German village just east of Frankfurt. 2 of Benjamin's cousins by marriage had already emigrated to New York and joined a relative named J.H. Stern to start a small company importing men's suit linings. The company was doing well. Word was sent back to Germany that there was room for more Oppenheimers. Julius was put to work in the warehouse, sorting bolts of cloth. He was tall, thin-limbed, and awkward. But he had an eye for colour, and he was determined. Within a decade he had taught himself English so thoroughly that friends would later describe it as remarkably good. He read widely in American and European history. He spent his weekends roaming New York's art galleries. By the turn of the century, he was a full partner in the firm of Rothfeld, Stern and Company. Always dressed in a white high-collared shirt, a conservative tie, and a dark business suit. A family friend later said that Julius had all the sensitiveness of both his sons and called him one of the kindest men he had ever known. It was probably in one of those galleries that Julius met Ella Friedman, a young painter of Bavarian Jewish extraction whose family had settled in Baltimore in the 1840s. She was exquisitely beautiful, slim, tallish, with expressive grey-blue eyes and long black lashes. She was also hiding something. Ella had been born with a congenitally unformed right hand. She wore long sleeves at all times and a pair of chamois gloves. The glove on her right hand contained a primitive prosthetic device with a spring attached to an artificial thumb. She never spoke of it. She had studied the early Impressionists in Paris. She taught art at Barnard College. She had her own students and a private rooftop studio. For a woman at the turn of the century, this was remarkable. For a woman who carried a hidden disfigurement with such composure that some acquaintances never noticed it at all, it was something more. Julius worshipped her. Just days before their wedding, Ella wrote to him she wanted him to be able to enjoy life in its best and fullest sense and asked if he would help her take care of him. To take care of someone whom one really loves, she wrote, has an indescribable sweetness of which a whole lifetime cannot rob me. They married on the 23rd of March, 1903, and moved into a stone house on West 94th Street. A year later, on the 22nd of April, 1904, in the midst of the coldest spring on record, Ella gave birth to a son after a difficult pregnancy. Julius had settled on the name Robert. At the last moment, he added a first initial, J. The birth certificate reads Julius Robert Oppenheimer, evidence that Julius meant to name the boy after himself. This would be unremarkable, except that naming a child after a living relative is contrary to European Jewish tradition. The boy would always be called Robert, and he in turn would always insist, with a stubbornness that bordered on performance, that the J stood for nothing at all. Sometime after Robert's birth, the family moved to a spacious 11th floor apartment at 155 Riverside Drive, overlooking the Hudson River. The apartment occupied an entire floor. Over the years, it became a kind of private museum. Ella chose the art, a 1901 Blue Period Picasso titled Mother and Child, a Rembrandt etching, paintings by Vuillard, Derain and Renoir. 3 Van Goghs dominated the living room, enclosed field with rising sun, First Steps after Millet, and Portrait of Adeline Revue, all hanging against wallpaper gilded in gold. Later came a sand drawing and a painting by Vlaminck. A sculpted head by Charles Despiau completed the collection. This was not the home of a man who sorted cloth in a warehouse. This was the home Julius had willed into existence through sheer effort, and it was magnificent. Ella ran it with exacting standards. Excellence and purpose was a constant refrain in young Robert's ears. 3 live-in maids kept the apartment spotless. Robert had a Catholic Irish nursemaid named Nellie Connolly, and later a French governess who taught him a little French. German was not spoken at home, Ella did not speak it well, and Julius did not believe in speaking it. On weekends, the family drove through the countryside in a Packard with a grey uniformed chauffeur. When Robert was 11 or 12, Julius bought a summer home at Bay Shore on Long Island, 7 acres with a large vegetable garden and masses of flowers. He moored a 40-foot sailing yacht called the Lorelei at the pier below the house. A family friend observed that Robert was doted on by his parents and brought up in luxury, but none of his childhood friends thought him spoiled. He was extremely generous with money and material things. 4 years after Robert's birth, Ella bore another son, Louis Frank Oppenheimer. The infant died soon afterward, a victim of pyloric stenosis, a congenital obstruction of the stomach. Ella became more fragile in her grief and more protective of Robert. She kept him apart from other children, fearing germs. He was never allowed to buy food from street vendors. Instead of taking him to a barber shop, she had a barber come to the apartment. Robert spent his early childhood in the comfortable loneliness of his mother's world on Riverside Drive, reading, painting landscapes, and collecting minerals. The relationship between mother and son was intense. Ella encouraged everything intellectual and forbade everything unpleasant. A family friend remembered that she would never allow anything disagreeable to be mentioned at the table. Robert quickly sensed that his mother disapproved of the people in Julius's world of trade, first-generation Jews, whose manners she found obtrusive. More than most boys, Robert grew up torn between his mother's severity and his father's warmth. He sometimes felt ashamed of Julius's spontaneity, and then guilty that he felt ashamed. Julius's articulate and sometimes noisy pride in Robert annoyed the boy greatly, a childhood friend recalled. As an adult, Robert gave his old teacher, Herbert Smith, a fine engraving from Shakespeare's Coriolanus, the scene where the hero unclasps his mother's hand and throws her to the ground. Smith was certain Robert was acknowledging how difficult it had been to separate from Ella. In 1908, when Robert was 4, Julius enrolled the family in the Ethical Culture Society, a uniquely American institution founded by Felix Adler, the son of a rabbi, who had come to believe that organized religion had outlived its moral usefulness. Ethical culture was not a religion. It was a framework for living. Its motto was deed, not creed. Adler taught that human worth resided not in supernatural reward, but in the commitment to social justice and independent thought. Man must assume responsibility for the direction of his life and destiny, Adler wrote. The Ethical Culture School, where Robert would spend his formative years, placed the study of ethics, loyalty, truthfulness, the obligations of the strong toward the weak, at the centre of its curriculum. It valued empirical exploration and the free-thinking mind. In short, it valued everything that would later define Robert Oppenheimer as a physicist. And it instilled in him a moral seriousness that would, decades later, make him unable to live comfortably with what physics had built. Harvard almost killed him. Not the coursework. He finished the chemistry requirement in 3 years, graduating summa cum laude in 1925, taking 6 courses a term when most students took 4, and reading so voraciously across physics, philosophy, French literature, and classical Greek that his professors struggled to keep up with him. Percy Bridgman, the experimental physicist who became his mentor, said flatly that it was perfectly clear Oppenheimer was brilliantly gifted. The problem was everything else. Robert arrived at Harvard in the autumn of 1922, 18 years old. Fresh from a debilitating bout of colitis that had delayed his enrollment by a year, he was thin and fragile and entirely alone. His classmates at Ethical Culture had at least tolerated his eccentricities. At Harvard, he had no such buffer. He did not know how to make friends. He did not know how to eat in a dining hall without feeling watched. His roommate, Frederick Bernheim, later recalled that Robert had bouts of deep depression, periods when he would lie in his room, unable to move, consumed by what Bernheim called melancholia. He was very fond of Robert, Bernheim said, but the darkness was unmistakable. What made it worse was that Harvard was, in the early 1920s, in the grip of a quiet but vicious debate about Jewish enrollment. President Abbott Lawrence Lowell had proposed a quota on Jewish admissions, arguing with the antiseptic language of institutional self-preservation that too many Jews would change the character of the university. The proposal was ultimately defeated, but the atmosphere it created, one of genteel exclusion, of Jews tolerated but not quite welcomed, seeped into the social fabric. Robert never spoke publicly about experiencing anti-Semitism at Harvard, but his friend Francis Ferguson, who knew him as well as anyone, noted that Robert's Jewishness was something he carried with a peculiar discomfort, not shame exactly, but a lifelong ambivalence, a sense of being both inside and outside whatever room he occupied. He graduated and sailed for England. The Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge was the most prestigious physics institution in the world, and Robert had been accepted to work under J.J. Thomson, the discoverer of the electron. It should have been a triumph. Instead, it was a catastrophe. The trouble was that Robert was a theorist trapped in an experimentalist's world. Cavendish was a place of instruments, of careful measurement, of patient hands working with delicate apparatus. Robert's hands were not patient. He was clumsy in the laboratory. He hated the work. He began to spiral. The depression that had flickered at Harvard now consumed him entirely. He could not sleep. He could not eat. He was, by his own later account, and the accounts of those around him, on the edge of a genuine breakdown. And then he did something that has never been fully explained. He left a poisoned apple on the desk of Patrick Blackett, his tutor. The apple was laced with chemicals from the laboratory. Blackett did not eat it. The university was notified. Robert's parents intervened, Julius came to Cambridge, and the matter was handled with the discretion that money and social standing could buy. There was talk of probation. There was talk of a psychiatric evaluation. Robert was sent to a therapist in London who reportedly concluded that the young man suffered from sexual frustrations and a deeply ambivalent relationship with his mother. The therapist also concluded that the case was so severe that treatment would be of little use. Robert spent that Christmas holiday in Corsica with two friends, Francis Ferguson and Paul Horgan. One evening, Ferguson mentioned casually that he had recently become engaged. Robert's reaction was violent and bizarre. He lunged at Ferguson and tried to strangle him. Ferguson broke free. The incident was never reported, and Ferguson, with a generosity that is difficult to fathom, remained Robert's friend for the rest of his life. But it revealed something about the depth of the turmoil inside this young man, a capacity for sudden, irrational aggression that coexisted with his extraordinary intellect like a fault line running beneath a cathedral. He recovered. Or rather, he found something that made recovery possible. In the spring of 1926, he left Cambridge for the University of Göttingen in Germany, and there, under Max Born, he encountered the new quantum mechanics, the theoretical framework that was, at that very moment, rewriting the rules of the physical universe. Robert had found his medium. He was not meant to work with his hands. He was meant to work with equations, with abstractions, with the invisible architecture of matter. At Göttingen, surrounded by some of the finest minds in European physics, Werner Heisenberg, Enrico Fermi, Paul Dirac, Wolfgang Pauli, he came alive in a way he never had before. He was still difficult. Born later wrote that Robert was so quick, so aggressive in seminars, that other students sometimes petitioned to have him restrained. He interrupted constantly. He finished other people's sentences. He could be withering. But he was also, for the first time in his life, doing exactly what he was built to do. He earned his doctorate at 23. His dissertation on the quantum theory of continuous spectra was technically accomplished, if not revolutionary. More importantly, he had emerged from the worst period of his life with something like equilibrium. Not happiness. Robert Oppenheimer would never be an uncomplicated person, and the shadows that had nearly consumed him at Cambridge would never fully recede. But he had learned to channel his vast, restless, sometimes self-destructive energy into the one domain where it could do something other than harm. After Göttingen, he travelled. He spent time at Leiden and Zurich, impressing European physicists with his fluency in Dutch, his knowledge of Sanskrit, his habit of reading the Bhagavad Gita in the original. And then, in the summer of 1928, he did something that would shape the rest of his life more than any equation ever would. He went to New Mexico. In the autumn of 1929, Robert Oppenheimer accepted two simultaneous appointments, one at the University of California at Berkeley, the other at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. He would split his time between the two, teaching at Berkeley in the fall and spring, and at Caltech during the winter. It was an unusual arrangement, but Oppenheimer was an unusual hire. American theoretical physics barely existed as a discipline. The great work was being done in Europe, in Göttingen, Copenhagen, Cambridge. Oppenheimer's explicit mission was to change that. To build something at Berkeley that could rival the European schools, and he threw himself into it with a ferocity that startled his colleagues. He was a terrible teacher at first. His lectures were too fast, too dense, too littered with allusions to Sanskrit poetry and French literature and the finer points of Dutch grammar. He chain-smoked through every class, lighting one cigarette from the stub of the last, and his handwriting on the blackboard was nearly illegible. He would sometimes pause mid-sentence, stare at the ceiling as if receiving a transmission from somewhere far away, and then resume at a pace that left half the room behind. His students nicknamed him Oppie, a name that would follow him for the rest of his life. Some of them worshipped him. Others found him unbearable. There was no middle ground. But over the next several years, something remarkable happened. He learned to teach, or rather, he learned to inspire, which for his purposes was the same thing. By the mid-1930s, he had assembled around himself a circle of graduate students so devoted that they dressed like him, talked like him, smoked the same brand of cigarettes, and adopted his mannerisms, the tilted head, the soft voice, the way he would say ya when someone made a point he found interesting, a linguistic artifact of his time in Germany. His students called themselves the Nim Nim Boys, a phrase borrowed from Oppie's own verbal tic. They followed him from Berkeley to Caltech and back again each year, like migratory birds. One of them, Robert Serber, became a lifelong collaborator and friend. Another, Philip Morrison, would follow him all the way to Los Alamos and eventually to the ruins of Hiroshima. What Oppenheimer built at Berkeley was, by the end of the 1930s, the finest school of theoretical physics in the United States. It was also the place where something unexpected happened to the man himself. For the first time in his life, Robert Oppenheimer began to notice the world outside physics. He would later say, under oath, that his political awakening began in 1936, and that three things caused it: the Depression, the rise of fascism in Europe, and the plight of his own graduate students, many of whom could not find jobs even after completing their doctorates. These were plausible explanations. They were also incomplete. Because what really happened was Jeanne Tatlock. Jeanne was the daughter of John Tatlock, a professor of English literature at Berkeley. She was brilliant, beautiful, politically passionate, and deeply troubled. She was studying medicine. She was also a member of the Communist Party. Robert met her in the autumn of 1936, and the effect was immediate and transformative. Friends who had known him as an unworldly aesthete, a man who, by his own admission, had not read a newspaper or voted in an election until he was 30, watched in astonishment as he began attending political meetings, making donations to left-wing causes, and speaking with conviction about labour rights, racial justice, and the Spanish Civil War. Jane opened the door, Oppenheimer later wrote, though he cut that phrase from the final version of his testimony, as if even the metaphor revealed too much. Through her, he met a network of activists, organisers, and intellectuals, many of them connected to the Communist Party. He donated money to the cause of the Spanish Republic. He joined the Executive Committee of the American Civil Liberties Union, which the FBI, in its characteristically broad definition of subversion, classified as a Communist Party front group. He hosted fundraisers. He signed petitions. He gave speeches at events organised by party members. He let his apartment on Eagle Hill become a gathering place for the Berkeley left. The relationship with Jean was turbulent. She suffered from deep depression, the same kind that had nearly destroyed Robert at Cambridge, though in Jean's case it was more severe and more persistent. They were together, then apart, then together again. Robert later testified that they saw each other intermittently from 1936 until 1939. But the truth, as it usually was with Oppenheimer, was more complicated than that. Jean Tatlock would remain in his life and in his thoughts long after their romantic relationship ended. Meanwhile, Robert's younger brother Frank had gone further. In 1937, Frank formally joined the Communist Party. He drove up to Berkeley to tell Robert in person. Robert was upset, not on ideological grounds, but because party membership carried real professional risk for a young physicist without tenure. Frank's wife, Jackie, was also a member, and together they threw themselves into the work, the teachers' union, the consumers' union, the cause of migratory farm workers. Frank could be strident. He once assailed a colleague as a hopeless bourgeois, not in sympathy with the proletariat. Robert, characteristically, made light of it afterward, noting that Frank was passionately fond of music, had many non-communist friends, and spent his summers at the ranch. He could not have been, Robert said with dry affection, a very hard-working communist. The question that would consume investigators, prosecutors, journalists, and historians for decades was whether Robert himself had crossed the line from sympathiser to member. The answer, as far as anyone has been able to determine, is that the line itself was designed to be uncrossable, and that Oppenheimer lived on it with a deliberateness that looks, in retrospect, less like naivety and more like an act of carefully preserved ambiguity. His friend Harcon Chevalier, a professor of French literature at Berkeley, charming, well-connected, and politically active, later insisted that Robert had been a member of a closed party unit, a small group of faculty who met twice a month to discuss politics. Chevalier said they met at his house or at Oppenheimer's. He said there were 6 or 7 members, later as many as 12. He said they discussed events in the world, not physics. He said they paid dues, except for Oppenheimer, who he assumed contributed through some special channel because he probably paid much more than he was supposed to. But when pressed on what made this group a Communist Party unit, as opposed to simply a group of left-leaning professors, Chevalier's answers dissolved into ambiguity. When asked whether they received orders from the party, he said no. When asked what made them members, he said they paid dues. When asked again whether they were really party members, he said, in a phrase that captures the entire muddle of 1930s Berkeley radicalism better than any FBI report ever could, we both were and were not, any way you want to look at it. Steve Nelson, a charismatic Communist Party leader in San Francisco, who knew Oppenheimer socially during these years, offered a similar assessment. He said Robert was a close sympathiser, that they had discussions of policies of the left, that the general mood of the group was anti-fascist and pro-alliance. But when asked directly whether Oppenheimer was a party member, Nelson said he could not prove or disprove the point, and would just leave it at that. Years later, reflecting on the whole affair, Nelson observed that whether one had a party card or not did not matter. Oppenheimer was associated with the causes of the left, and that was enough to murder him politically. Before there was a laboratory, there was a plateau. The Pajarito Little Bird Plateau sits at roughly 7,200 feet in the Chemes Mountains of northern New Mexico. A broad mesa of volcanic tuff carved by canyons into long finger-like strips of flat land. Ponderosa pines grow at the higher elevations. Pion and juniper scrub the lower slopes. The light at that altitude is sharp and particular. It bleaches the rock white and throws shadows so precise they look painted on. The ancestral Pueblo people knew this land first. They carved homes into the soft, tough centuries before any Europeans set foot in the Western Hemisphere. Their descendants, the people of San Ildefonso Pueblo, of Santa Clara, of Cochiti and Jemez, remained. They farmed the bottomlands along the Rio Grande. They made pottery in traditions unbroken for generations. They regarded the mesa not as empty space awaiting a purpose, but as a place with a history already written into the stone. Beginning in 1887, Hispanic homesteaders moved onto the plateau. They came from the small communities of the northern Rio Grande Valley, Espaola, Chimay, Poake, families whose roots in New Mexico stretched back centuries. To the original Spanish colonial settlements, they built log cabins, planted corn, beans and melons, kept chickens and cows and horses. The homesteads were modest but self-sustaining. Victor and Refugio Romero built their cabin in 1913. It had one room, homemade furniture, a cast iron stove. They raised 6 children there, inhabiting the cabin from April to November each year, living off 15 acres of cultivated land. By 1942, 12 homesteads on the plateau were still under original ownership. 7 more remained in the hands of the original families. There were also 2 Anglo-owned enterprises, the Los Alamos Ranch School, a private boarding school for boys founded in 1917 on land purchased from a homesteader named Harold Brooke, and the Anchor Ranch, a working cattle operation. The plateau was sparsely populated, but it was not empty. It had owners, it had families, it had names. Then the army came. In November of 1942, Major John Dudley was dispatched to find a site for a secret weapons laboratory somewhere in the American Southwest. He had inspected dozens of locations. He settled on Jemez Springs, a deep canyon about 40 miles northwest of Santa Fe. When Oppenheimer and a Berkeley colleague named Edwin McMillan arrived to inspect it, they argued that the canyon was too narrow, too confined, and had no view of the mountains. General Leslie Groves drove up, took one look, and said it would never do. Oppenheimer then suggested, as if the idea had just occurred to him, that if they continued up the canyon and onto the mesa, there was a boys' school that might work. They drove 30 miles across the lava mesa and pulled up to the Los Alamos Ranch School in a drizzle of late afternoon snow. Schoolboys were running around in shorts on a playing field. Behind the main lodge there was a skating pond and a view that stretched 40 miles east to the Sangre de Cristo Range. Groves surveyed the scene and announced, "This is the place." Within 2 days, the army initiated the paperwork to acquire the school. What happened next to the homesteaders varies depending on whose account you read. The government's records describe a process of legal condemnation and fair compensation. The families tell a different story. Rosario Martinez Fiorillo, the granddaughter of Victor and Refugio Romero, recalled the arrival of the army in simpler terms. All of a sudden, she said, the army declared, "You cannot come and plant any more over here. We are going to take over. The government wants your land." The compensation was not equal. The Los Alamos Ranch School received approximately $225 per acre. The Anchor Ranch received roughly $43 per acre. The Hispanic homesteaders were paid as little as $7 per acre. Some landowners never received payment at all. Most had no legal representation. Some families have said, across decades of testimony, that they were removed at gunpoint. The bulldozers had barely finished grading the roads when the first scientists began arriving in March of 1943. They came from universities across the country, Princeton, Chicago, MIT, Berkeley, Columbia, carrying suitcases and security badges and almost no understanding of where they were going. Their mail would be addressed to P.O. Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Their driver's licenses would be confiscated and replaced with documents that listed no name, only a number. Their children would be born in hospitals where the birth certificates read simply, place of birth, Post Office Box 1663. For the next 2.5 years, this community of physicists, chemists, engineers, soldiers, and their families would live inside a fence on a mesa that did not officially exist, doing work they could not discuss even with each other unless they shared the same laboratory. The man who had to make all of this function was 39 years old, weighed 128 pounds, and had never managed anything larger than a graduate seminar. Oppenheimer's transformation in the first months at Los Alamos was so total that people who had known him for years struggled to reconcile the man they saw with the man they remembered. Robert Wilson, a young experimental physicist from Princeton, had initially disliked Oppenheimer. He found him arrogant, a smart aleck who did not suffer fools gladly. Wilson had serious doubts about whether Oppie could run a laboratory. So did James Conant, the president of Harvard, who wrote privately to General Groves in December of 1942 that he and Vannevar Bush were wondering whether they had found the right man to be the leader. The early signs were not encouraging. Oppenheimer had listed himself on the organization chart as both director of the laboratory and chief of the theoretical division, an arrangement so impractical that his colleagues had to explain to him why one person could not do both jobs. He told Groves he thought 6 scientists, joined by some engineers and technicians, could build the bomb. This was so wildly wrong that even generous accounts describe it as incredibly naive. The initial construction budget was $300,000. Within a year, $7.5 million had been spent. By the summer of 1945, more than 4,000 civilians and 2,000 uniformed personnel lived on the mesa in 300 apartment buildings, 52 dormitories, and some 200 trailers. But if the initial disorganization was alarming, the correction was astonishing. Within months, Wilson watched Oppenheimer metamorphose. The once eccentric theorist, the long-haired left-wing intellectual, became a first-rate, highly organized leader. He had style and he had class, Wilson said. Whatever we felt about his deficiencies, in a few months he had corrected those deficiencies and obviously knew a lot more than we did about administrative procedures. Wilson found himself, against every expectation, falling under Oppenheimer's spell. When I was with him, he said, I was a larger person. I became very much of an Oppenheimer person and just idolized him. I changed around completely. This was not Wilson's experience alone. Oppenheimer possessed a quality that is difficult to describe without sounding hyperbolic, a capacity to make the people around him feel more intelligent, more capable, more committed than they had believed themselves to be. Hans Bethe, the German-born physicist whom Oppenheimer appointed to lead the theoretical division on Isidor Rabi's recommendation, put it most precisely. He did not dominate, Bethe said. He never dictated what should be done. He brought out the best in us, like a good host with his guests. Part of this was intellectual. Oppenheimer could follow the work of every division simultaneously, the experimental physics, the theoretical calculations, the chemistry and metallurgy, the ordnance engineering, and synthesize it into a coherent picture faster than anyone else on the mesa. He attended every colloquium. He asked questions that cut to the centre of problems that had stalled for weeks. He remembered everything. Part of it was personal. He learned people's names, asked about their families, noticed when someone was struggling. When the 24-year-old Richard Feynman told Oppenheimer he could not move to Los Alamos because his wife Arline was battling tuberculosis, Oppenheimer did not simply accept the refusal. He called Feynman from Chicago, long distance, to say that he had located a tuberculosis sanatorium in Albuquerque where Arline could be treated. Feynman could work on the mesa during the week and visit her on weekends. Feynman was touched. He came. Oppenheimer was relentless in his recruitment. He wrote to John Manley, his deputy, that they should start immediately on a policy of absolutely unscrupulous recruiting of anyone they could lay hands on. He pursued Robert Bacher, a MIT physicist, for months before Bakker finally agreed to direct the experimental physics division on the condition that he would resign if ever asked to wear an army uniform. He lured group after group from Princeton, Chicago, and Berkeley, often by sheer force of personality. When Rabi warned him that morale was sinking among a group of physicists working in Princeton, Oppenheimer imported the entire team of 20 scientists, a decision that brought not only Wilson, but also Feynman to the Mesa. Rabi himself would not move to Los Alamos. He believed radar would win the war, and he did not want the culmination of 3 centuries of physics to be a weapon of mass destruction. It was an extraordinary objection, and one that Oppenheimer, who in any other season of his life might have dwelled on its philosophical implications for weeks, now brushed aside without hesitation. He wrote to Rabi that if he truly believed this project was the culmination of 3 centuries of physics, he would take a different stand. To him, it was primarily the development in time of war of a military weapon of some consequence. The Nazis, he wrote, did not allow them the option of not carrying out that development. This was the argument that silenced every doubt. The Germans might get there first. It was the argument that brought pacifists to the Mesa, that persuaded men who hated war to build the most destructive weapon ever conceived. Robert Wilson, who had been a Quaker pacifist before the war, put it simply: it was quite a change to find himself working on this horrible project. But like everyone else, he feared above all the prospect of the Nazis winning the race. Rabi refused to come full-time, but he agreed to serve as a visiting consultant, and this arrangement proved invaluable. He became Oppenheimer's fatherly advisor, the one man on the project who could tell Oppie when he was being foolish and be listened to. Rabi and Lee Dubridge from MIT forced Oppenheimer to create a proper organizational structure, divisions and groups, chains of command, clear lines of responsibility. Without Rabi, Bethy later said, it would have been a mess, because Oppie did not want to have an organization. The laboratory was a small city, and like any city, it could not function without the people who kept it running. The physicists and chemists and engineers were the celebrated residents, the names that would appear in the histories, the memoirs, the biographies. But beneath them, around them, woven into the daily machinery of life on the Mesa, was a workforce that arrived each morning on Green Army buses and departed each evening to communities that the scientists had, for the most part, never visited and could not have found on a map. The buses stopped first at the Hispanic towns of the northern Rio Grande Valley: Espaola, Chimay, Pojoaque, Num, Santa Cruz. Then they continued to the pueblos, San Ildefonso, Santa Clara, Cochiti. The men who climbed aboard were hired as construction workers, carpenters, truck drivers, gardeners, maintenance crews, and janitors. The women were recruited as maids, housekeepers, cooks, childcare providers, and mess hall staff. They built the barracks. They poured the concrete foundations for the laboratories. They cleaned the offices where the calculations were made. They cooked the meals that fed the scientists who split the atom. They minded the children, Peter Oppenheimer among them, while the mothers attended colloquia or worked as technicians in the technical area. The laboratory came to depend on them so completely that the evidence of this dependence survives in one peculiar administrative fact. Every year, on the 23rd of January, the entire laboratory shut down. It was San Ildefonso Day, the feast day of the nearby pueblo, and so many of the maintenance and custodial workers were from San Ildefonso that the facility simply could not operate without them. The physicists who had built a weapon capable of levelling a city could not keep their own buildings open for a single day without the people who swept the floors and fixed the plumbing. Ellen Bradbury Reed, whose father worked in the high explosives division, remembered this vividly. The whole lab would close, she recalled, because you could not get enough maintenance workers to run it. This was not a symbolic gesture of cultural respect, it was a logistical reality. The laboratory needed these workers the way a body needs circulation, constantly, invisibly. And with consequences that became apparent only when it stopped. The relationship between the scientific community and the Pueblo workers was complex and, in some respects, deeply contradictory. The scientists were fascinated by Pueblo culture. They collected pottery with what one historian called a collector's mania. Maria Montoya Martinez, a potter from San Ildefonso, whose black-on-black ceramics were already gaining national recognition, found her work in sudden, enormous demand. Scientists and their wives flocked to acquire pieces. There were cultural exchanges, square dances, holiday feasts, social events where the two communities mingled. But the fascination had an edge to it. The Pueblo people, as that same historian observed, became exotic. Their differences made them objects of romance within the scientific community. It was admiration, certainly, but it was admiration of a particular kind, the kind that studies its subject without quite recognizing the subject as an equal. Meanwhile, the mesa was expanding onto San Ildefonso ancestral land. The 43 square miles occupied by the Los Alamos community incorporated territory the Pueblo had known for centuries. With time, contaminants from the laboratory, chemical and radiological, would be detected in water and air samples taken on or near Pueblo lands. This would take decades to measure, longer to acknowledge, and even longer to begin addressing. The Pueblos were eventually provided annual funds to evaluate the extent of possible health and environmental effects. But the fundamental transaction was never renegotiated, the land was taken, the labour was used, and the record of both was kept in a filing cabinet that almost nobody opened. The Hispanic workers faced similar dynamics. Ezequiel Salazar, who worked as a carpenter and surveyor during the construction phase, later said simply, "We all took a part in it." Lydia Martinez, Francis Quintana, and Eulalia Quintana Newton, women from the surrounding communities, spent decades working at the laboratory, some of them building careers that lasted well into the post-war era. Newton worked there for 53 years, rose to the position of group leader, and received a Distinguished Performance Award. She did not have a college degree. She declared, late in life, that she had been treated royally and could not have accomplished more than she did. Hers is a story of genuine opportunity born from wartime necessity, and it is also a story that complicates any simple narrative of pure exploitation. The truth, as it usually is, was both things at once. But if some workers found opportunity, the broader pattern was one of invisibility. The contributions of hundreds of northern New Mexicans, Hispanics, Pueblos, and Anglos were not documented during the war. They were not interviewed for the official histories. Their names do not appear in the celebrated accounts. Willie Atencio, a local historian who spent years collecting oral testimonies from surviving workers and their descendants, put it plainly, the contributions of hundreds of northern New Mexicans need to be documented. We need to hear from the people who were there. And then there were the women. More than 640 women worked at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, constituting roughly 11% of the total workforce. They were not all secretaries. They were not all wives. Among them were physicists, chemists, metallurgists, mathematicians, biologists, and engineers, involved in every aspect of the atomic effort from the earliest calculations to the final assembly of the weapon. Elder Anderson studied neutron spectroscopy and later helped establish the field of health physics. Elizabeth Graves researched which configurations of reflective material best kept neutrons inside the bomb and accelerated the chain reaction. Naomi Livesey worked on the chemistry of fission products. Frances Dunn was the only woman in the explosives assembly group. Her small hands and manual dexterity allowed her to adjust weapons components more precisely than her male colleagues could. Floy Agnes Lee, a biologist of Santa Clara Pueblo descent, worked as a hematology technician, drawing and testing the blood of scientists who had been exposed to radiation. She had originally aspired to join the Women Air Force Service pilots, but the program was disbanded before she could enlist. She went to Los Alamos instead. After the war, she earned a doctorate from the University of Chicago and worked at Argonne National Laboratory for 22 years. By October of 1944, women constituted approximately 30% of the labour force in the technical area, the hospital and the schools. The vast majority were scientists or technicians, not clerical workers. They were present at every stage of the project except one, Project Alberta, the final phase in which the assembled bomb was physically delivered to the Pacific island of Tinian for deployment. The women who had spent years contributing to this moment were left behind in the United States to learn about the results from the radio, along with everyone else. It happened in the winter of 1943, probably in January or February, at Oppenheimer's home on Eagle Hill in Berkeley. The details that survive are sparse and contradictory, which is precisely what made them so dangerous. What is not in dispute is the setting: a kitchen, a cocktail party in the adjacent room, and two men, Robert Oppenheimer and his close friend Håkon Chevalier, standing alone for no more than a few minutes while Robert mixed drinks. Chevalier brought up the name of George Eltonton, a British-born physicist and shell engineer who worked at the radiation laboratory and was known to have contacts with the Soviet consulate in San Francisco. According to Oppenheimer's later testimony, the version he would eventually settle on. After years of telling different versions, Chevalier said that Eltonton had mentioned he had a means of transmitting technical information to Soviet scientists. The implication was clear. Someone was feeling out whether Los Alamos scientists might be willing to share secrets with the Soviet Union. Oppenheimer said he shut it down immediately. He told Chevalier it was a terrible idea and that it would be tantamount to treason. Chevalier agreed. The conversation ended. They returned to the party. Drinks were poured. The evening continued as if nothing had happened. That should have been the end of it. Two friends had a brief, uncomfortable exchange. One of them proposed something foolish. The other rejected it without ambiguity. In any ordinary life, the episode would have evaporated by morning. But Oppenheimer's life was not ordinary, and this 2-minute conversation in a kitchen would metastasize over the next 11 years into the single most damaging piece of evidence used against him. The trouble began in August of 1943, roughly 6 months after the kitchen conversation. Oppenheimer was summoned to meet with Lieutenant Colonel Boris Pash, an Army intelligence officer responsible for security at the radiation laboratories in Berkeley. Oppenheimer knew he had an obligation to report the Eltonton approach, and he did, but not in the way a reasonable person might expect. Instead of simply describing what had happened, a friend relayed an inquiry from a man with Soviet contacts, and Oppenheimer refused. He told Pash an elaborate, dramatic, and almost entirely fabricated story. In this version, there were not one but 3 scientists who had been approached. There was an intermediary, someone acting as a go-between for Eltonton and the scientists. Oppenheimer described the scheme in vivid, circumstantial detail as if narrating a spy thriller. He would not identify the intermediary. He would not name the 3 scientists. He painted a picture of a sophisticated espionage network operating in the shadow of the Manhattan Project, a picture that bore almost no resemblance to the mundane reality of a friend making an ill-considered remark at a cocktail party. Why did he do it? This question has occupied investigators, prosecutors, biographers, and historians for 8 decades, and no fully satisfying answer has ever emerged. Oppenheimer himself, when confronted with the discrepancy years later, called his fabricated account a tissue of lies and described himself, with a self-lacerating precision that was characteristic of the man, as an idiot. He said he had been trying to protect Chevalier without implicating himself. He said he had been foolish. He said the whole thing was a cock and bull story. But the damage of the fabrication was twofold, and it operated in opposite directions simultaneously. First, it inflated the incident. By describing a network of 3 contacted scientists and an intermediary, Oppenheimer had created the impression of a serious espionage ring. Exactly the kind of threat that military security officers are trained to take seriously. Lieutenant Colonel Pash took it very seriously indeed. The FBI took it seriously. An investigation was opened, and because Oppenheimer refused to name names, the investigation remained open, a wound that would not close. Second, when Oppenheimer finally told the truth, or what he said was the truth. In 1946, naming Chevalier as the friend and reducing the story to its actual proportions, the correction made him look worse, not better. He had now told 2 incompatible versions of the same event. One of them was a lie. He admitted as much. The question that would haunt him was simple and devastating. Which version was the lie? If the first version was false, as Oppenheimer insisted, then he was a man who had invented an elaborate fabrication when speaking to military intelligence during wartime, an act that suggested, at minimum, profoundly poor judgment. If the second version was false, then the first version, the one describing a real espionage network, was the truth. And Oppenheimer had later tried to cover it up to protect his friend, or his brother, or himself. By the spring of 1945, the laboratory had split into 2 parallel tracks. The uranium bomb, a gun-type weapon, simple in concept, in which one mass of enriched uranium was fired into another to achieve a critical chain reaction, was considered so straightforward that it would never be tested before use. There was not enough uranium for a test and a weapon. It would be dropped on a city, and that would be the test. The plutonium bomb was a different matter entirely. Plutonium could not be detonated by the gun method. The fissile material had to be compressed inward, imploded, using a precisely shaped shell of conventional explosives that would detonate simultaneously from every point on its surface, crushing a softball-sized sphere of plutonium to a fraction of its original volume and triggering a nuclear chain reaction. The engineering required to make this work was staggering. The explosive lenses had to be machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The detonation had to be synchronized to within microseconds. If any segment of the implosion was even slightly asymmetrical, the plutonium would squirt out through the gap like toothpaste and the weapon would fail. Nobody was confident it would work. Oppenheimer certainly was not. A test was essential, and a site had been chosen, a flat stretch of desert in the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man. About 210 miles south of Los Alamos, the test was given the code name Trinity. Oppenheimer later said he had taken the name from a sonnet by John Donne, Batter My Heart, Three-Personed God, though he added with characteristic opacity that he did not know why that particular poem had come to mind. In the weeks before the test, a betting pool circulated among the scientists. Edward Teller wagered 45 kilotons. Oppenheimer, with either modesty or pessimism, bet a mere 300 tons, a fraction of what even the most conservative calculations predicted. Isidore Rabi, who arrived late, took the only number left, 18 kilotons. Enrico Fermi, with the gallows humour of a man who understood exactly what they were about to do, wandered among his colleagues, offering side bets on whether the bomb would ignite the atmosphere, and if so, whether it would destroy only New Mexico or the entire world. Some of the younger scientists laughed, some did not. The device was hoisted to the top of a 100-foot steel tower at ground zero on the 13th of July. It looked nothing like the sleek projectile that popular imagination would later associate with atomic weapons. It was a squat, bulbous sphere, the gadget, they called it, studded with detonator cables and surrounded by diagnostic equipment. Oppenheimer climbed the tower to inspect it personally. He was, by every account, a wreck of nervous energy. He had lost still more weight. He was chain-smoking. He could not sit still. The test was scheduled for the early morning of the 16th of July. The night before, a thunderstorm rolled across the Jornada del Muerto, and for several hours it seemed possible that the test would have to be postponed. Oppenheimer and Groves argued about the weather. Lightning cracked across the desert. Rain fell on the tower. The scientists in the forward bunkers, positioned 10 miles from ground zero, sat in the darkness and waited. Some of them applied sunscreen, having been told that the flash would be extraordinarily bright. Some lay face down in the sand. Hans Bethe tried to calculate, for the 100th time, whether the atmosphere would in fact catch fire. It would not, probably almost certainly. At 5:29 in the morning, the device detonated. The light came first. It was not like sunlight. It was not like any light anyone in that desert had ever seen. It was a white-violet flash so intense that it was visible in Albuquerque, 120 miles to the north, and in El Paso, almost 200 miles to the south. Scientists wearing dark welding glass saw the desert floor illuminated as if by a second sun. Some who had turned away saw the bones of their own hands through their closed eyelids, the flash bright enough to render flesh translucent. Enrico Fermi, standing 10 miles from the tower, dropped small pieces of paper into the air as the shockwave passed, and by measuring how far they were displaced. Estimated the yield at roughly 10 kilotons. He was close. The actual yield was approximately 21 kilotons, the equivalent of 21,000 tons of TNT. Rabi won the betting pool. The shockwave hit the forward observation post with a sharp crack and a blast of hot wind. Men who had been lying in the sand felt themselves lifted and pressed into the earth. The steel tower had been completely vaporized. In its place was a crater of fused green glass, trinitite, they would call it, stretching nearly 800 yards in every direction. A column of fire and debris climbed into the pre-dawn sky and flattened into the shape that would become the defining image of the 20th century, a mushroom cloud rising to more than 38,000 feet. Kenneth Bainbridge, the physicist who had directed the test, walked up to Oppenheimer in the aftermath and said something that required no elaboration: "Now we are all sons of bitches." Oppenheimer's own reaction has been recounted so many times that it has acquired the texture of scripture. Years later, in a televised interview, he said that a line from the Bhagavad Gita had come to mind: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Whether he actually thought this at the precise moment of detonation, or whether it was a retrospective framing imposed by a man who could not resist literary self-construction, is impossible to know. What is known is that in the hours and days following the test, he was simultaneously elated and devastated, and that both emotions were genuine. He had done what he set out to do. The gadget worked, the war would end, and something else had begun that could not be undone. The scientists saw the flash from 10 miles away through dark welding glass, lying face down in prepared bunkers. They had been warned. They had sunscreen and goggles and blast shields. They had spent months calculating the exact yield, the thermal pulse, the radius of destruction, the height of the mushroom cloud. They knew, in precise physical terms, what was about to happen. 12 miles from ground zero, in the small ranching communities scattered across the Tularosa Basin, nobody knew anything. At 5:29 that morning, people who were still asleep were woken by a light so intense that some of them believed the sun was rising from the wrong direction, from the west instead of the east. Others, already awake and starting morning chores, saw the sky turn white. Then came the blast. It rattled windows. It knocked pictures off walls. In some homes closer to the test site, it shattered glass. And then, within hours, something began to fall from the sky. The radioactive cloud generated by the Trinity detonation rose to more than 38,000 feet and then began to drift. As it cooled and dispersed, it deposited fallout, a fine powdery ash laced with fission products, across a wide swath of central New Mexico. The ash settled on rooftops and cisterns. It coated the grass that cattle grazed on. It dusted the vegetable gardens that families tended for food. It dissolved into the water that people drank. No one in the Tularosa Basin had been told that a weapons test was taking place. No evacuation had been ordered. No health advisories were issued. Not that morning, and not in the weeks and months that followed. The government was not unaware that fallout was a concern. Internal Manhattan Project documents show that the possibility of radiological contamination in surrounding communities had been discussed before the test. The decision was made to proceed anyway. After the detonation, Army monitors drove through the nearby towns with Geiger counters. Some readings were elevated. In a few locations, they were significantly elevated. The response was not to inform the public. The response was to classify the data. What the monitors could not have measured, and what would take decades to become visible, was the biological toll. Radioactive isotopes like iodine-131 and cesium-137 do not announce themselves. They are absorbed into the body through contaminated food and water. Iodine concentrates in the thyroid gland. Cesium mimics potassium and is distributed throughout muscle tissue. Strontium-90 behaves like calcium and is deposited in bones. These isotopes emit radiation from within, damaging cells, corrupting DNA, and initiating the slow, invisible process that may, years or decades later, manifest as cancer. The communities downwind of the Trinity site were predominantly Hispanic, families who had lived in the Tularosa Basin for generations, subsistence ranchers and farmers whose lives were rooted in the land and the water that the fallout had contaminated. They were not wealthy. They did not have political connections. Many did not speak English as a first language. They were, in every sense that mattered to the bureaucratic machinery of post-war America, invisible. The cancers appeared gradually. At first, there was nothing to connect them. A thyroid condition here, a leukemia there, a child with an illness that seemed out of proportion to anything the family had experienced before. But as the years passed, patterns began to emerge. Entire families reported multiple cancer diagnoses across generations. Communities that had no prior history of elevated cancer rates found themselves attending funerals with a regularity that could not be explained by chance alone. The word downwinder entered the local vocabulary, a term that carried, in a single compound noun, both a geographic description and an accusation. The formal epidemiological data remains to this day incomplete. This is not because the data is inherently uncollectible. It is because, for decades, nobody collected it. The government conducted extensive studies of the health effects of radiation on the Japanese survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, data that became the foundation of international radiation safety standards. It conducted studies of the downwinders near the Nevada test site, where atmospheric testing continued from 1951 to 1963. But the Trinity downwinders were not studied, they were not monitored, they were not in any formal sense acknowledged. This absence is itself a piece of evidence. After Trinity, Manhattan Project leadership determined that all future above-ground testing of nuclear weapons should take place at least 150 miles from the nearest urban setting. This decision was an implicit recognition that the Trinity test had been conducted too close to populated areas and that the radiological consequences had been unacceptable. But the recognition was operational, not humanitarian. It informed the planning of future tests. It did nothing for the people who had already been exposed. In 1990, the United States Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA. The law established a framework for compensating individuals who had developed specific cancers as a result of exposure to radiation from uranium mining or atmospheric nuclear testing. It covered downwinders who lived near the Nevada test site, residents of designated counties in Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. It covered uranium miners and millers who had worked in government programs. It did not cover New Mexico. The people who had been closest to the first atomic detonation in history, closer than any Nevada downwinder had ever been to any subsequent test, were excluded from the compensation program entirely. The reason was not malice, exactly, it was bureaucratic architecture. RECA was designed around the Nevada testing program, which was well documented, extensively monitored, and politically visible. The Trinity test, by contrast, was a single event that had occurred before the compensation framework was imagined. There were no dosimetry records for the surrounding communities. There were no health studies to cite. The absence of data that the government had chosen not to collect, became the justification for the absence of compensation. The gap in the record became the proof that no harm had been done. For the families of the Tularosa Basin, this circular logic was not abstract. It was the reason they held bake sales and enchilada suppers and car washes to pay for chemotherapy. It was the reason a 2-year-old girl from Tularosa who lost her eye to cancer had her treatment funded by a community fundraiser rather than by the government that had detonated a nuclear weapon in her grandparents' backyard. Tina Cordova understood this logic intimately. She was a co-founder of the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, an organisation established to document the health effects of the Trinity test and to fight for inclusion in RECA. Cordova was herself a cancer survivor, diagnosed with thyroid cancer at the age of 39, a disease strongly associated with exposure to radioactive iodine. She had spent more than 18 years, by her own account, collecting health surveys, compiling family histories, and travelling to Washington to testify before congressional committees. She had watched the people who started the journey with her die, one by one, without ever seeing acknowledgment. What I will tell you, Cordova said, is that when this bill finally passes, there will be people in New Mexico and across the American West who will for the first time ever be acknowledged. And honestly, I have lost count of all the people who started out on this journey with me who are gone now and will never see that day. The legislative path was long and bitter. In 2024, a bipartisan group of senators, including New Mexico Democrats and a Missouri Republican, proposed a standalone bill for the reauthorization and expansion of RECA to include Trinity downwinders and other previously excluded communities. The bill passed the Senate. It was blocked in the House. Cordova and other advocates were told it had majority support among representatives, but that the Speaker would not allow it to come to a vote. The politics of compensation, who deserves it, who qualifies, who has standing to claim injury from an event that occurred 80 years ago, proved more durable than the politics of the bomb itself. On the evening of the 23rd of July, 1945, Oppenheimer met with General Thomas Farrell and Lieutenant Colonel John Moynihan in his office at Los Alamos. These were the officers designated to supervise the bombing run from the island of Tinian in the Pacific. Oppenheimer was pacing, chain-smoking, his nerves visible in every stride. He wanted to make absolutely certain they understood his instructions. Do not let them bomb through clouds or through an overcast, he said. They had to see the target. No radar bombing. It must be a visual drop. If they dropped it at night, there should be a moon. They must not drop it in rain or fog. And they must not detonate it too high. The figure fixed on was just right. And if the altitude increased, the target would not receive as much damage. These were the words of a physicist ensuring optimal destruction. They were precise. They were technical. They were the words of a man who had spent 3 years building something and wanted it to work. On the 6th of August, at exactly 8:14 in the morning local time, a B-29 aircraft named Enola Gay, after pilot Paul Tibbitt's mother, released the untested gun-type uranium bomb over Hiroshima. Captain William Parsons, the arming officer aboard the aircraft, sent back a teletype reporting that the visible effects were greater than the New Mexico test. In Washington, John Manley, whom Oppenheimer had sent there specifically to report on the bombing, waited through a 5-hour communications delay before receiving the message. He tried to call Oppenheimer immediately, but was stopped by General Groves, who insisted no information be disseminated until the President himself made the announcement. Manley spent a restless night walking through Lafayette Park, across from the White House, waiting for morning. When the announcement came and Manley finally reached Oppenheimer by telephone, the prearranged code they had agreed upon was abandoned before a single word of it was spoken. Oppenheimer's first words were blunt. "Why the hell did you think I sent you to Washington in the first place?" Later that day, Groves called Oppenheimer from Washington. The conversation was congratulatory. Groves said he was proud of Oppenheimer and all of his people. Oppenheimer asked if it had gone all right. Groves replied that it had apparently gone with a tremendous bang. Oppenheimer said everybody was feeling reasonably good about it and extended his heartiest congratulations. Groves told him that one of the wisest things he had ever done was selecting the director of Los Alamos. Oppenheimer replied, with a diffidence that was either modesty or the first stirring of something else, "Well, I have my doubts, General Groves." On the Mesa, the news was broadcast over the public address system, "Attention please, attention please. One of our units has just been successfully dropped on Japan." Frank Oppenheimer was standing in the hallway outside his brother's office. His first reaction was relief. Thank God it was not a dud. But within seconds, he recalled, one suddenly got this horror of all the people that had been killed. That evening, a crowd gathered in an auditorium. Sam Cohen, one of the younger physicists, remembers a cheering, foot-stamping audience waiting for Oppenheimer. He entered from the rear of the hall rather than from the wings, walking up the centre aisle, a choice of staging that Cohen found deliberate and dramatic. On stage, Oppenheimer clasped his hands together and pumped them over his head like a prizefighter. He told the crowd it was too early to determine the full results, but that he was sure the Japanese did not like it. The crowd cheered. Then he said his only regret was that they had not developed the bomb in time to use it against the Germans. This practically raised the roof. It was a performance. Scientists are not conquering generals, and the role did not fit him. But the audience expected triumph, and Oppenheimer delivered it. He was only human. He had accomplished something that no one had accomplished before. The moment was intoxicating. It was also, as he would soon discover, the last uncomplicated moment of his public life. 3 days later, the plutonium bomb, the type tested at Trinity, was dropped on Nagasaki. On the Mesa, the celebrations of Hiroshima were not repeated. Charlotte Serber observed that a palpable sense of gloom settled over the laboratory. Word spread that Oppie was saying the atomic bomb was so terrible a weapon that war was now impossible. An FBI informant reported that he was a nervous wreck. The reports from the ground began filtering back in October when Phil Morrison and Bob Serber returned from Japan with the first group of scientific observers. Morrison had landed in Hiroshima 31 days after the bombing. What he saw there would stay with him for the rest of his life. Virtually everyone in the street for nearly a mile around, he reported, was instantly and seriously burned by the heat of the bomb. He described people who wore striped clothing upon whom the skin was burned in matching stripes. He described people who had thought themselves lucky, who had crawled out of the ruins of their homes with minor injuries and who died days or weeks later from radiation. Jean Backer listened to Morrison's account and went home unable to sleep. She lay awake shaking all night. Morrison was the only one, she said, who really made her understand what had happened. He had a wizard tongue and descriptive power. And what he described was a city that had been erased in the time it takes a rifle bullet to cross it. One bomber and one bomb, Morrison said, had turned a city of 300,000 into a burning pyre. That was the new thing. Serber described something that distilled the grotesque asymmetry of atomic warfare into a single image. In Nagasaki, he noticed that the sides of telephone poles facing the explosion were charred. He followed the line of charred poles out beyond 2 miles from ground zero. At one point, he saw a horse standing in a field. One side of the animal, the side that had faced the blast, was completely hairless, the skin seared clean. The other side was perfectly normal. The horse was grazing contentedly. When Serber mentioned this detail with a note of dark levity, observing that the horse seemed happy enough, Oppenheimer scolded him for giving the impression that the bomb was a benevolent weapon. Oppenheimer was by now in a state that his closest friends found alarming. He and Kitty retreated to Perro Caliente, their cabin in the Sangre de Cristos. For the first time, they had been truly alone in 3 years. Robert wrote letters to old friends. To Herbert Smith, his former teacher, he wrote that the undertaking had not been without its misgivings, and that those misgivings were heavy on them today, when the future, which had so many elements of high promise, was yet only a stone's throw from despair. To his Harvard roommate Frederick Bernheim, he wrote that he and Kitty were at the ranch in an earnest but not too sanguine search for sanity. In the months following Japan's surrender, he became the most recognizable scientist in America, more visible than Einstein, who was an icon but had played no direct role in the bomb's construction. Oppenheimer appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He appeared on the cover of Life. His gaunt face, the pork pie hat, the dangling cigarette became symbols of a new kind of American power, intellectual, devastating, morally complex. He was invited to speak before congressional committees, advisory boards, and elite gatherings across the country. He was consulted by generals and cabinet secretaries and, on several occasions, by the president himself. At the age of 41, he had become what very few scientists in history have ever been, a political figure. He used the position to say things that powerful men did not want to hear. Before a Senate committee in late 1945, he dismissed the Manhattan Project as frantic and rather ruthless exploitation of the known. They had taken a tree with a lot of ripe fruit on it, he said, and shaken it hard, and out came radar and atomic bombs. The whole spirit had been one of exploitation, not discovery. The war had practically stopped real physics. He argued that America's nuclear monopoly was temporary and that no military countermeasure could prevent the delivery of atomic weapons by an enemy. The nation's safety, he insisted, could not lie wholly or even primarily in its scientific or technical prowess. It could be based only on making future wars impossible. These were not the words Washington wanted from the father of the atomic bomb. Washington wanted reassurance, confirmation that the monopoly would hold, that the weapon was a shield, that American technological supremacy guaranteed American security for the foreseeable future. Oppenheimer was telling them the opposite. He was saying, in language that left no room for misunderstanding, that the bomb could not protect them and that building more bombs would only accelerate the day when someone else had one too. In October of 1945, he secured a private meeting with President Truman. It went badly. Oppenheimer was nervous, intense, and characteristically unable to modulate his emotions for a political audience. At some point during the conversation, he told the president that he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman was offended. He later told Dean Acheson, his Undersecretary of State, that he did not want to see that son of a bitch in his office ever again. The blood, Truman reportedly said, was on his hands. He had made the decision to drop the bomb, and he did not need a physicist coming in to share the guilt. The meeting crystallized something. Oppenheimer was operating in a world where moral anguish was treated not as evidence of conscience, but as evidence of unreliability. A man who agonized over the weapon he had built was, in the calculus of Cold War Washington, less useful than a man who did not. The doubt that Oppenheimer carried so visibly, the doubt that, in another context, might have been recognized as wisdom, became a liability. It marked him as someone whose loyalties were divided, not between countries, but between the imperatives of power and the demands of his own conscience. In Washington, this was a distinction without a difference. He moved to Princeton in the autumn of 1947 to become director of the Institute for Advanced Study. The position was prestigious. Einstein was already in residence, and it gave Oppenheimer a platform from which to shape national policy on atomic energy without being embedded in the bureaucracy. He chaired the General Advisory Committee of the newly created Atomic Energy Commission, a body that wielded significant influence over the direction of nuclear weapons policy. He advised on matters of arms control, international cooperation, and the future of nuclear research. His opinions were sought, his speeches were reported, and his warnings were, for a brief window, taken seriously. But the window was closing. The political landscape was shifting beneath him. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union had disintegrated into mutual suspicion. Winston Churchill had delivered his Iron Curtain speech in 1946. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, committed the United States to containing Soviet influence worldwide. The House Un-American Activities Committee was investigating communist infiltration of Hollywood and the federal government. Loyalty oaths were being imposed across the civil service. The atmosphere was thickening with fear, and fear had a way of making Oppenheimer's past associations, the party meetings, the donations, the friendships with known communists, look far more sinister in retrospect than they had appeared at the time. On the 29th of August 1949, at an isolated testing site in Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The American monopoly, Oppenheimer's cake of ice melting in the sun, was over. It had lasted exactly 4 years. 9 days later, an American B-29 reconnaissance plane flying over the northern Pacific picked up radioactive readings on special filter paper designed to detect precisely this kind of event. The news was transmitted to Washington. Nobody wanted to believe it. Truman himself expressed skepticism. A panel of experts was convened. Vannevar Bush was asked to chair it, but Bush insisted that Oppenheimer serve on the panel. They met on the 19th of September and within 5 hours reached a unanimous conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming. The Soviets had tested a plutonium bomb, and furthermore, it was a close copy of the Manhattan Project's implosion design. When Oppenheimer heard that Truman was sitting on the news, reluctant to make a public announcement, he was incredulous. An opportunity was being missed, he told David Lilienthal, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, to seize the initiative, to use the Soviet achievement as leverage for a renewed push toward international control of nuclear weapons. But Truman waited 3 days and then issued a grudging statement that an atomic explosion had occurred in the Soviet Union, pointedly refusing to call it a bomb. The reaction in Washington was not the measured reassessment Oppenheimer had hoped for. It was panic. Legislators on Capitol Hill immediately began calling for a dramatic response. Truman endorsed a proposal from the Joint Chiefs to accelerate the production of nuclear weapons. The American stockpile, which in June of 1948 had stood at approximately 50 bombs, would rise to roughly 300 by June of 1950. But for some, this was not enough. Lewis Strauss, an ex-commissioner with a taste for strategic absolutes, circulated a memorandum arguing that America could only regain its advantage over the Soviets through what he called a quantum jump in technology. The nation needed a crash program to develop the hydrogen bomb, the super. Edward Teller had been dreaming of the super for years. The concept had been discussed as early as 1942 during the wartime conferences at Berkeley that preceded the creation of Los Alamos. While the other physicists focused on fission, the splitting of heavy atoms, Teller was captivated by fusion, the process that powers the sun. A fusion bomb would work by forcing together light hydrogen isotopes at temperatures of millions of degrees, releasing energy on a scale that dwarfed anything a fission weapon could produce. There was no theoretical upper limit. You could make the explosion as large as you wanted simply by adding more fuel. A single hydrogen bomb could destroy an entire metropolitan area. It was not a weapon designed for military targets. It was a weapon designed for cities. Oppenheimer had always been sceptical. He had written to James Conant that he was not sure the miserable thing would work, nor that it could be gotten to a target except by oxcart, a reference to the expectation that the device would be too enormous to deliver by aircraft. But his objections went deeper than engineering. The hydrogen bomb horrified him on moral grounds. It was too big for any conceivable military target. It was, as he and the General Advisory Committee would argue, a weapon whose only purpose was the indiscriminate slaughter of civilian populations on a scale that made Hiroshima look restrained. In late October of 1949, Oppenheimer travelled to Cambridge, Massachusetts, for a meeting of Harvard's Board of Overseers. He stayed at Conant's home, and the two men talked late into the night about the super. Conant was not merely sceptical, he was outraged. He told Oppenheimer that the hydrogen bomb would be built over his dead body. Conant believed that a civilized country should not even consider deploying a weapon that was, in his view, nothing less than a genocide machine. The General Advisory Committee met at the end of October to formulate a recommendation. The committee included some of the most distinguished scientists in the country: Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Isidore Rabi, James Conant, Lee Dubridge, Cyril Smith, Hartley Rowe, and Oliver Buckley. Their report, drafted largely by Oppenheimer, was unanimous in its opposition to a crash program. The technical problems remained formidable, no workable design existed, and Teller's theoretical models had never been validated, but the committee also issued a moral warning. An annex to the report, signed by Fermi and Rabi, described the hydrogen bomb as necessarily an evil thing considered in any light, and argued that its very existence would threaten the future of the human race. An earlier statement, drafted years before by Arthur Compton, on behalf of a scientific panel that had included Oppenheimer, Lawrence and Fermi, had gone even further. Compton had written that the panel would prefer defeat in war to victory obtained at the expense of the enormous human disaster that the hydrogen bomb's determined use would cause. This was an extraordinary declaration, four of the most eminent scientists in the country stating, in writing, that they would rather lose a war than win one with this weapon. 4 days before Christmas, 1953, Lewis Strauss, now chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, summoned Oppenheimer to his office and handed him a letter. The letter informed him that a new review of his background and policy recommendations had resulted in his being designated a security risk. It listed 34 charges. The charges ranged from the absurd to the political. Among them, that in 1940 he had been listed as a sponsor of the Friends of the Chinese People, that he had attended a fundraiser for the Spanish Republic, that he had associated with known communists during the 1930s, and, most damagingly, that in the autumn of 1949 and subsequently he had strongly opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb. The past and the political had been welded together into a single indictment, as if attending a fundraiser in 1938 and questioning weapons policy in 1949 were expressions of the same underlying pathology. Strauss offered Oppenheimer a choice: resign quietly from his government advisory positions or face a formal hearing. Oppenheimer was stunned. He stared through the car window as he was driven to the Georgetown home of his lawyer and close friend Herbert Marx. Anne Marx, Herbert's wife and Oppenheimer's former secretary at Los Alamos, watched him arrive in what she described as an almost despairing state of mind. For hours, Robert, Kitty, Herbert and Anne debated the options. Resignation would mean accepting the premise, conceding that he was unfit to serve. Fighting would mean submitting to a process whose outcome, given the political climate, was far from certain. Oppenheimer chose to fight. He drafted a letter to Strauss that night. Under the circumstances, he wrote, resignation would mean that he accepted and concurred in the view that he was not fit to serve the government he had served for some 12 years. This he could not do. If he were thus unworthy, he continued, he could hardly have served his country as he had tried, or been the director of the Institute in Princeton, or spoken. As on more than one occasion he had found himself speaking, in the name of science and country. By the end of the evening, Robert was exhausted. He retired upstairs. A few minutes later, Anne, Herbert and Kitty heard a terrible crash. They raced upstairs and found the bedroom empty, the bathroom door closed. Anne could not get it open. She could not get a response. Oppenheimer had collapsed on the floor and his unconscious body was blocking the door. They gradually forced it open. When he revived, he was mumbling. He had taken one of Kitty's prescription sleeping pills. A doctor was called. For nearly an hour, they walked him back and forth, coaxing him to swallow sips of coffee. The hearing convened on the 12th of April, 1954, in room 2022 of the Atomic Energy Commission building, a drab, windowless space that was not a courtroom and offered none of a courtroom's protections. The proceeding was classified as an administrative review, not a trial. This distinction was everything. In a trial, Oppenheimer would have had the right to cross-examine hostile witnesses, to review all evidence against him, and to have his attorneys hold security clearances granting them access to classified material. In this hearing, he had none of these things. His lead attorney, Lloyd Garrison, had no security clearance. He could not see large portions of the documentary evidence being used against his own client. When classified material was discussed, which was frequently, given that the entire case revolved around Oppenheimer's work on the most secret weapons program in American history, Garrison was asked to leave the room. He would return to find that arguments had been made in his absence that he could neither review nor rebut. Roger Robb, the attorney appointed to present the government's case, had no such handicap. Robb had access to Oppenheimer's complete FBI file, 7,000 pages of surveillance records, wiretap transcripts, informant reports, and interview summaries accumulated over 13 years. He knew what Oppenheimer had said in every previous interview, every security review, every casual conversation that the Bureau had managed to record. Oppenheimer, by contrast, was working from memory. He had not been permitted to review his own file. When Robb confronted him with inconsistencies between his current testimony and statements made a decade earlier, statements that Oppenheimer could not remember making, the effect was devastating. On the 23rd of May, 1954, the Grey Board returned its formal verdict. By a vote of 2-1, Chairman Gordon Gray and board member Thomas Morgan concluded that Oppenheimer was a loyal citizen who was nevertheless a security risk. His clearance, they recommended, should not be restored. Their reasoning bent under its own weight. They did not accuse Oppenheimer of violating any law or any security regulation. They acknowledged his loyalty. But they found that his continuing conduct and associations reflected a serious disregard for the requirements of the security system. They found a susceptibility to influence which could have serious implications. They found his conduct in the hydrogen bomb program sufficiently disturbing to raise a doubt, and they concluded, regretfully, that he had been less than candid in several instances in his testimony. What this meant, stripped of its bureaucratic insulation, was that Oppenheimer was guilty of having friends the government did not approve of expressing opinions the government did not welcome, and of having told a lie 11 years earlier about a kitchen conversation. Among other deviations, the majority opinion noted Oppenheimer had exhibited excessive friendship. Loyalty to one's friends, Graham Morgan wrote, is one of the noblest of qualities. Being loyal to one's friends above reasonable obligations to the country and to the security system, however, is not clearly consistent with the interests of security. The father of the atomic bomb was being convicted of caring too much about the people he knew. Ward Evans, the third board member, dissented with a clarity that shamed the majority. Most of the derogatory information, Evans wrote, was in the hands of the committee when Oppenheimer was cleared in 1947. They took a chance because of his special talents, and he continued to do a good job. Now when the job is done, we are asked to investigate him for practically the same derogatory information. There was not the slightest vestige of information, Evans continued, that would indicate Oppenheimer was disloyal. He hates Russia. To deny him clearance now for what he was cleared for in 1947, when he was less of a security risk now than he was then, seemed hardly the procedure to be adopted in a free country. Evans concluded with a sentence that would outlast the majority opinion by decades, "I personally think that our failure to clear Dr. Oppenheimer will be a black mark on the escutcheon of our country." But the Grey Board's recommendation was not the final word. It was only a recommendation. the 5 commissioners would make the binding decision, and here Strauss went to work. Kenneth Nichols, the ex-general manager, drafted a letter to the commissioners that went far beyond the Grey Board's findings. Working under the guidance of Strauss, Nichols reinterpreted the entire case. He dismissed the hydrogen bomb issue, which had been central to the Grey Board's reasoning, as politically awkward. Instead, he shifted the emphasis entirely to the Chevalier affair. But he embraced a reading of the evidence that the Grey Board itself had rejected, where the board had accepted Oppenheimer's admission that he lied to Colonel Pash in 1943. Nichols reversed the conclusion. He argued that the elaborate story Oppenheimer told Pash was actually the truth, and that the simpler version Oppenheimer told later, the version confirmed by both Chevalier and Eltonton, was the lie. Nichols presented no new facts. He suppressed the fact that Eltonton's independent FBI interview had corroborated Oppenheimer's later account. He merely asserted a theory and presented it as though it were proven. Oppenheimer's lawyers knew nothing of Nichols' letter. When Commissioner Henry DeWolf Smith, the only scientist on the panel, requested that Garrison be allowed to respond, Strauss blocked the request without explanation. Strauss then worked the commissioners. He treated them to lunches. He discussed employment opportunities with Smith. Commissioner Eugene Zuckert, initially inclined to fine for Oppenheimer, reversed his position. He resigned from the acre the day after signing the majority decision and entered private law practice in Washington. Strauss subsequently transferred a considerable volume of legal business to Zuckert's firm and retained him as a personal advisor. Harold Green, the acre lawyer who had drafted the original charges, believed something untoward had occurred. Smith alone held firm. He worked through the night of the 28th of June with 2 assistants, rewriting his dissent from scratch after learning the majority opinion had been completely redrafted. Through his window, he could see a car parked outside his house. 2 men sitting in it watching. He told an assistant that it was funny he should be going to all this trouble for Oppenheimer, since he did not even like the man much. In the spring of 1954, Robert Oppenheimer sits in room 2022 of the Atomic Energy Commission building in Washington, being cross-examined about dinner party conversations from the 1930s. His attorney has been excluded from classified portions of the proceedings. His career in public service is being dismantled over a 2-minute conversation in a kitchen. The newspapers cover the hearing on their front pages. Editorial boards weigh in. Columnists debate whether the father of the atomic bomb is a patriot or a traitor. The nation watches. At the same time, in the small towns of the Tularosa Basin, Carrizozo, Tularosa, Alamogordo, San Antonio, families are living with illnesses they cannot explain and cannot afford to treat. 9 years have passed since a flash of light woke them before dawn. Nobody from the government has come to ask them how they are feeling. Nobody has tested their water or their soil. Nobody has connected the cancers appearing in their communities to the radioactive ash that fell on their gardens and their cisterns and the grass their cattle ate. They are not on the front page of anything. In the hallways of Los Alamos, where 282 scientists will sign a letter protesting the verdict against Oppenheimer. The workers who physically built the laboratory are not asked to sign anything. The Hispanic construction crews and carpenters and janitors, the Pueblo women who cleaned the offices and minded the children, the truck drivers who hauled materials up the single winding road to the mesa, they are not part of the protest because they are not part of the record. Their contributions were essential. Their names were not preserved. When the history of Los Alamos was written in the years following the war, it was written as a story about physicists. The people who poured the concrete, wired the buildings, and served the meals existed in the margins of a narrative they had helped make possible. In the formal histories, and celebrated biographies published in the decades after the hearing. The women who worked in the technical area, the physicists, chemists, metallurgists, and mathematicians who constituted 30% of the laboratory workforce at peak operation, are largely absent. Their experiments are attributed to the groups they worked in. Their names appear, if at all, in footnotes. The reports written after the war omitted their contributions so routinely that it took specialised research, conducted decades later, to establish that they had been there at all. This is the full picture, and it is uncomfortable precisely because it does not resolve into a simple accusation. Nobody sat down and decided to erase the homesteaders, the workers, the women, and the downwinders from the historical record. There was no memorandum ordering their exclusion. What happened was something more ordinary and more systemic. At every stage where a choice was made, whom to interview, whom to quote, whose testimony to record, whose suffering to study, whose contribution to name, the choice followed the path of least resistance. The scientists were famous, so the scientists were documented. The workers were anonymous, so the workers were not. The downwinders lived in poor, rural, predominantly Hispanic communities far from Washington, so their health was not monitored. The women did their work alongside men who were later celebrated, so their work was subsumed into the men's accounts. Each individual decision was, on its own terms, defensible. Nobody writing the first histories of Los Alamos thought they were committing an act of erasure. They were writing about what they knew, which was the physics and the physicists, but the accumulated effect of 1,000 defensible decisions was a record with a hole in it, a history that told one story so loudly that it drowned out all the others. He remained director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he continued to host some of the finest minds in the world. He gave lectures that audiences described as dazzling, elegant, erudite, dense with illusion, delivered in that soft, hypnotic voice that had once held a mesa full of physicists in its grip. He read poetry aloud to dinner guests, George Herbert, John Donne, the Bhagavad Gita. He sailed in the Virgin Islands with his family. He entertained diplomats and scholars at Oldham Manor, the director's residence, where Kitty served champagne picnics and Robert held forth on everything from quantum mechanics to French Impressionism to the obligations of the intellectual in a democratic society. But the people who knew him best saw something different. The old sharpness was there, but it was wrapped in a weariness that had not been there before. He smoked more, he drank more, he was thinner than ever. His friend the diplomat George Kennan, who had known him for a decade, observed that the hearing had taken something from Oppenheimer that could not be restored, not his intellect, which remained formidable, but his faith that the system he had served was capable of fairness. Robert never said this directly. He was too proud for that and too disciplined. But it was visible in the way he carried himself after 1954, a man who still performed brilliance, but who had stopped believing that brilliance mattered to the people who made decisions. He travelled. He lectured in Europe and South America. In Paris, he saw Hakon Chevalier for the first time in years. The meeting was cordial but strained. Too much had happened between them, and too much of what had happened had been Oppenheimer's doing. Chevalier had published a novel, The Man Who Would Be God, that was transparently based on their friendship and its destruction. The book was not kind to its Oppenheimer figure. Robert read it and said nothing. In the autumn of 1963, word came that President Kennedy had approved the Fermi Award for Oppenheimer. It was understood by everyone who understood Washington as a gesture of rehabilitation, not a reversal of the verdict, but a signal that the government regretted what had been done. McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, waited to gauge the Republican reaction before confirming that the president would personally present the award at a White House ceremony. On the 22nd of November, Oppenheimer was sitting in his office working on a draft acceptance speech when his son Peter knocked on the door. Peter had heard on his car radio that Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. Robert looked away. His assistant Werner Hobson dashed in moments later. Robert turned to Peter and asked if he would like a drink. Peter nodded. Robert walked to the closet where liquor was kept and then stood there, motionless, his arm hanging by his side, his fourth finger repetitively rubbing his thumb. Gazing downward at the bottles, he could not move. Peter finally mumbled, "Well, never mind then." As they walked out together, Hobson heard Robert say quietly, "Now things are going to come apart very fast." He told Peter later that nothing since Roosevelt's death had felt like that afternoon. Johnson went ahead with the ceremony. Teller was in the audience. Kitty was radiant. Robert was stone. The years after the award were quiet and diminishing. He continued to direct the institute, but his health was failing. The decades of chain smoking, 4 or 5 packs a day at his worst, had done their work. In the summer of 1965, during a vacation on St. John in the Virgin Islands, he noticed difficulty swallowing. The diagnosis was throat cancer. He underwent surgery. He underwent radiation therapy. He underwent chemotherapy that ravaged his already fragile body. The cancer in his throat was, in the end, eradicated by the radiation treatment, but the chemotherapy destroyed his liver. The cure killed what the disease had not. On the 18th of February 1967, Robert Oppenheimer died at his home in Princeton. He was 62 years old. The memorial service was held at Alexander Hall on the Princeton campus. 600 people attended. The audience included Nobel laureates, diplomats, poets, composers, and a representative from the White House. Strains of Stravinsky's Requiem canticles, a work Robert had heard and admired in that very hall the previous autumn, filled the auditorium. Hans Bethe gave the first eulogy. He said Oppenheimer had done more than any other man to make American theoretical physics great, and that he had brought out the best in them, like a good host with his guests. Henry DeWolf Smith, the one commissioner who had voted to restore the clearance, gave the second. "Such a wrong can never be righted," Smith said. "Such a blot on our history never erased." George Kennan gave the third. He recalled asking Oppenheimer during the darkest days of the hearing whether he had considered leaving the country. Oppenheimer's answer, delivered with tears in his eyes, had been, "Damn it, I happen to love this country." His ashes were scattered on the waters near St. John, where the trade winds blow across white sand beaches and the light is almost as sharp and clear as it is in New Mexico. Kitty lived 5 more years. She died of an embolism in 1972 in Panama while sailing with Bob Serber. Their daughter Tony, the one the family had always described as solid sensible, the one you never worried about, inherited the cottage on St. John. The FBI opened a file on her in 1969. She struggled to find steady work. Friends said she never fully recovered from the weight of her parents' lives. On a Sunday afternoon in 1977, Toni Oppenheimer hanged herself in her cottage on St. John. She was 32 years old. She left the property to the people of St. John to be used as a community park. Everybody loved her, a friend said afterward. But she did not know that. Every history is a selection. Someone decides what goes in and what stays out. Someone decides whose name appears in the chapter heading, and whose appears in the footnote, and whose appears nowhere at all. These decisions are rarely made with malice. They are made with deadlines, with word counts, with the assumption that the reader already knows who matters and who does not. And then the selection hardens into the record, and the record hardens into the truth, and the truth becomes so familiar that it no longer looks like a choice. It looks like the way things are. The story of the atomic age has been told for 80 years as a story of physicists, of Oppenheimer and Groves and Teller and Bethe and Fermi and Rabi, of men who understood equations that most human beings will never read, who worked in laboratories most human beings will never enter, and who built a weapon that changed the condition of human life on this planet. That story is true. Those men did those things. The equations were real. The weapon was real. The moral reckoning that followed, Oppenheimer's anguish, his warnings, his persecution, his silence was real. None of what we have told you about the hidden history diminishes any of that. But history is not only what happened, it is what was recorded. And what was recorded was shaped by who held the pen, who funded the archive, who sat for the interview, and who was asked. The homesteaders of the Pajarito Plateau were not asked. The Pueblo workers who shut down the laboratory every January were not interviewed for the official histories. The women who constituted a third of the technical area workforce were not named in the post-war reports. The families of the Tularosa Basin were not studied, not monitored, not compensated, and not acknowledged for 80 years. This is not a story about villains. Lewis Strauss was not a villain for prosecuting Oppenheimer. He was a bureaucrat who believed he was protecting national security, and he was wrong, and the wrongness consumed him. The scientists who wrote the first histories of Los Alamos were not villains for omitting the workers. They were writing about what they knew, which was physics. The government officials who excluded New Mexico from RACA were not villains. They were building a compensation framework around the data they had, and the data they had was incomplete because the data they needed had never been collected. At every stage, the failure looks reasonable in isolation. It is only when you stand back and see the pattern that the shape of the failure becomes clear. The shape is this: the people closest to power were documented. The people farthest from power were not. The physicist who directed the laboratory received a 3-week hearing, a transcript of 750,000 words, and a legacy that has been debated in every decade since. The carpenter who built the laboratory received a daily wage and a bus ride home. The woman who tested plutonium samples received a paycheck and an omission from the record. The rancher who watched radioactive ash fall on his garden received nothing at all, not a warning, not a diagnosis, not $1, until the 21st century. This is how history gets written, not through conspiracy, but through gravity, the gravity of prestige, of access, of proximity to the decisions that journalists and historians consider significant. The people who make the decisions get the chapters. The people who live with the consequences get, if they are fortunate, a paragraph. What should you walk away understanding? Not that the Oppenheimer story is false, it is true. Not that his suffering was undeserved, it was a travesty. Not that the hidden histories are more important than the celebrated one. They are not more important. They are equally important, and they have received a fraction of the attention. The act of choosing whose suffering counts as history is itself a political act. It happened here, with this story, in plain sight for 8 decades. It is happening now with other stories in other places that we have not yet learned to see. The antidote is not outrage. Outrage is easy and it fades. The antidote is attention, the slow, patient, unglamorous work of asking, every time a great story is told about a great figure, who else was in the room? Who built the room? Who cleaned it? Who lived on the land before the room was there? And what happened to them after the great figure left? Robert Oppenheimer gave his ashes to the sea. The land he took for his laboratory was never given back. The families who lived on it before him are remembered now only because their descendants fought for decades to be remembered. The women who worked beside his physicists are known now only because other women, decades later, went looking for them. The downwinders are compensated now only because one cancer survivor in Tularosa decided 18 years ago that her community's suffering would not be filed under acceptable losses. These recoveries did not happen automatically. They happened because someone refused to accept the frame. If you have watched this far, you already understand that. The next time someone tells you a great story about a great man, and it will be a great story, because the great ones always are, ask one question. Just one. It will not diminish the story. It will complete it. Ask, who built the building he was standing in? If this documentary changed how you think about whose stories get told, share it with someone. Subscribe to this channel. And the next time you open a history book, check the index, not for the names that are there, but for the names that are missing. That is where the next story begins.